Although I am reminded of a conversation I had, which is important for what I want to say today. And it was with a community leader in a remote area of Colombia. And when I asked her how they were coping with the pandemic, she looked at me rather oddly. We were on virtual platform, and said it wasn't a serious issue for them. Firstly, because they live every day with killer diseases like malaria, dengue fever. And secondly, because they'd always relied on local resources, local plants and medicines, natural remedies. So both the threat of the pandemic and their response to it look very different to them from my perspective, which, if you like, was a developed world and urban perspective. So I think for me, that illustrates a key point about human security, that it needs to force us away from generalities and macro data towards the specific, the local, and the nuanced, the fine-grained. So in this presentation, I want to look at human security in two ways. My two perspectives are: how does human security help us to view COVID-19 and the crisis? What aspects should we focus on to help us understand this challenge? And then what our response to the crisis, to the pandemic, should be. And of course, COVID isn't the only threat we face. There are others to do with climate crisis and a changing planet. So perhaps here is the biggest irony, to ask how human security, which is about individuals and their communities, is that appropriate to a crisis that's caused by humans, what we might call the Anthropocene crisis. So can you see my slides all right? And are you having to look at my notes or just the slides? Is that all right?
Yes, we do.
Okay, I just wanted to check. Thank you. So my second point, that's the first perspective, about what does human security tell us about this crisis. My second point is to ask whether these crises, the coronavirus, but also climate change and the planetary crisis, actually change our view of what human security is, and whether it's relevant, whether we're researchers, policymakers, or practitioners. What does the crisis and these crises tell us about human security, and whether it's a useful analytical and practical concept? I think you'll probably all be familiar with the kind of critiques that have been made against human security in the past. I suppose the most durable one is whether it actually amounts to anything. Is it just kind of hot air? Does it say anything different to other political discourses? So the hot air criticism, and there have been plenty of hot air balloonists, I could say, over the past nearly 30 years. And their main criticism is that it's just too imprecise, it's a fuzzy concept, it's not a policy paradigm, it's a worldview, and it's not really even a serious analytical tool. And then you have a very different kind of criticism, a conspiracy theory, if you like, within critical security studies. And these critiques go to the different end of the spectrum. They don't dismiss it as irrelevant. They say, actually, it's rather dangerous. It amounts to the securitization of human life, making politics out of things that should be left in the personal and private sphere. So human security becomes, if you like, the doorway to biopolitics and the manipulation of individuals. So both these critiques raise ethical and operational implications that we need to think about. And another charge that we can think about is that in order to do human security, particularly if we're researchers, we're inevitably engaged in subjective interpretations, which may not be authentic. So there's a question mark over how robust it is in terms of for being a social science investigation. And yet, what I would argue, which won't surprise you, is that human security does retain a value. It fills a gap, and this gap has become more rather than less apparent over 3 decades. And the gap is that conventional security narratives, conventional political narratives, don't take sufficient account of what individual experiences, needs, and aspirations mean for development, security, peace, social stability. And that individual experience is tied very much, obviously, to everyday needs, everyday necessities, water, housing, a decent job, being able to go to school. So policy agendas, whether they're in health or environment, education, economics, require us to capture that individual perspective. Coming back to the present crisis, in May 2020, UNDP estimated that global human development last year, as a combined measure of health, education, and living standards, was on course to decline because of the pandemic for the first time in 30 years. And I think that decline in basic standards tells you more about the crisis and its impact than national economic statistics, GDP, which is a conventional measure. I think, too, human security is also a thread that connects, some people call it a bridging concept. It connects what are often separate silos of activity and intervention, policy action. What the UN that I work with quite closely, they like to call the humanitarian peace, development peace nexus. But human security, I think, is a starting point, not just the end goal, but a starting point also for thinking about what is important to analyze and what to do, what kind of policy action to take. So my key takeaway, one of my key takeaways today is to encourage you to think not as of human security just as an objective, something that needs to be delivered, a nice kind of ambition, but it is the basis for a different kind of methodology. It's a different kind of analytical metrics, and those metrics begin with people's stories and perceptions. They include the dynamics of relations between different social actors, how they exercise and claim agency, and it uses granular and local data. And I think you've had some sessions already on methodology and so on. But for me, this is a really important aspect to bear in mind with human security. It's not just kind of our end goal, but it's also about how we do things, whether we're policymakers or researchers. So what is the added value if we look at human security from a policy and practice perspective? We can see very much how this, the analytical viewpoint of human security and the methodology plays out in the COVID crisis. So many aspects of the crisis are straight out of the human security playbook. First, and most obviously, COVID-19 attacks our humanity. It's about us as a species, what we are as human beings. So we need to stay grounded in that personal dimension, including the relevance of actual experiences. And while statistical modeling plays a large part in managing the pandemic, because this disease, perhaps uniquely, attacks individual bodies in different ways. So many people have very different symptoms and outcomes from the pandemic. And also, as we've seen, it affects societies differentially. We have to move from the general to the personal and the specific, the local or the grounded. I think another way in which it gives us a good lever, a good handle on the crisis is that we're talking about protection here. It's very much, protection is very much a leitmotif in government's responses to the crisis. We have to think about how to protect the most vulnerable. We also have to protect healthcare systems in developed countries or build them up in underdeveloped countries. And indeed, for political regimes to survive, I think it will be very much dependent on how they perform and respond to the crisis. And going forward, the idea of prevention that's implicit in human security, prevention, building capacity to withstand multiple shocks that the pandemic represents, not just the health shock, but the economy, jobs, mental as well as physical health. That also, prevention has to be part of our toolkit. And it's become very apparent that we can't combat this crisis on one front alone. It's not about the economy versus people's health. What we need are integrated responses that tackle the multiple and simultaneous dimensions of the pandemic. And finally, solutions to it. Solutions, how do you make government action and solutions work? They only have traction if they take people with them and co-opt them as, if you like, co-owners or even architects of measure to fight virus transmission. And I think in many societies, we've seen that the difference in outcomes is determined about things like how the government communicates, how much it listens also to local communities. And I think here is something that, again, comes straight out of the human security kind of methodology and perspective that is relevant. It's that sense of empowerment and enabling and agency. So how could human security, if it gives us an analytical tool, how could it help us rebuilding as well, away from this crisis, coming out of it, hopefully, in not too long a time? So we know that human security gives us a methodology for working more effectively locally. And as I said, the community level has come to be seen to be important in this crisis because that's where actions are experienced, policy actions are experienced. It's where we understand the impact of the crisis, how the crisis affects not just people's health, but social stability, economics, all kinds of other policy areas. Now, I think security studies and security policies indeed sometimes struggle with the idea of localism, and conceptualizing what do we mean by local ownership. How do we encourage it in ways which don't ignite, in the context of fragile societies, particularly inter-ethnic, religious conflicts, sometimes giving voices to local people. Not all local people are good, there are bad as well, and there are tensions and fault lines. So the whole idea of going down to the community level sometimes is very problematic within those security studies and political narratives. But I think what a human security optic, if you like, a human security perspective can do is to highlight the role for more participatory governance, governance which is rooted in local realities. And human security also has, if you like, and I'm finding this a lot in the work I'm doing with the UN in local communities in conflict settings, that human security does have a persuasive power. It has a kind of rhetorical impact as somehow being beyond politics. It's something we can all agree on, that we should all have human security. So the focus on well-being and protecting the vulnerable, these take us out or help to take us out or beyond partisan politics. We can't remove them entirely, of course. Everything tends to be contentious, and the more difficult the local conditions and social fractures, the more challenging that will be. But I think human security can become a focal point for different actors, whether they're in government, civil society, or the private sector, to work together with the idea of creating comprehensive responses and responses that require multiple capacities. No one actor can resolve these crises and situations on their own. And I think the story, the conversation I told you at the beginning with the Colombian community leader illustrates the dangers of having a one-size-fits-all. So recovery programs are going to have to be very differential, and how we examine them and analyze them also has to take account of that local nuance. So I would say that a human security methodology is very useful, a bottom-up approach in identifying, perhaps better than other approaches, what are the salient risks, what's relevant, what are the needs, what are the expectations that each community faces. And I think, for me, I've been working in human security for longer than I care to say, but, I'm getting into definitely into my second decade and more. And it still seems in all that time, what we haven't got enough of are data sets that reflect that local reality. Our data sets are still predominantly national, they're regional, they're global often. So there is an urgent need to collect better data and to collect better experiences and narratives from people, and to have the people who are affected by both policy interventions but crisis as well, collecting it so they understand its context. In the Colombia project I'm doing, we call this last mile data. I think it's an economic term really, but that last mile data, right down to the very granular local level, is often missing, and it's a huge missing piece in the jigsaw puzzle that human security at least can help to try and fill. And I think the pandemic has also reminded us of the importance of how human beings interact. We are social animals, and we engage constantly. It can be in a politically neutral way. I mean, this is something for social observation. We can see how people work together, or sometimes don't work together. They fight. But the inequalities debate also underlines that interactions are politically loaded. There are power asymmetries, power imbalances in all human interactions, and this has become particularly evident during this crisis. So we need to tackle those imbalances. It's not easy, but using human security as a basis for dialogues where you focus on common risks, shared objectives, the ground that unites us, if you like, the overlaps. I think that is also useful in trying to think about a new relationship between power holders. People in the sort of build back better, the post COVID thinking, people are talking about a new social contract. Do we need a contract between power holders and say communities, between ordinary people that is more inclusive and also recognizes people's individual identities and capacities? And I think, again, human security is a good starting point for that kind of dialogue. So in Colombia, for example, we are using human security very much as a language and the common ground to bridge between very different interests. The interests in where I'm working is between, say, multinational companies, government, different levels of government, different people within the community. We tend to blanket all these as sort of generic groups, but of course within each group, whether you're talking about private sector, business, whether you're talking about government, whether you're talking about communities, within those groups, you could disaggregate and find multiple points of view, interests, agendas, and capacities. And I think that is both the challenge for human security, but also its benefit, that we can look at that granular level to see where the relationships are, what are the relationships and dynamics that matter. So in Colombia, what we're doing is we've created platforms and most specifically partnerships, which try to, if you like, even out some of these power imbalances, slightly level the playing field, and give marginalized groups a voice alongside traditional elites. And we call them human security partnerships. Finally, in thinking about how it helps us to envisage the changes that we're going to need, I think human security is well placed, if you like, to articulate a change in economic models, which will have to follow this pandemic. One of the talking points is whether we should shift more towards an economy of economics of care. It's much more, obviously it's become much more significant as a sector of the economy. Just as more people have been hospitalized, they need to be looked after when they're sick and when they're recovering. I recommend a really good book that Fiona Robinson wrote in 2011 on the ethics of care. She takes a feminist approach to human security. And she points out that care is about different relations of people and structures. It's not just about how much money public money we pour into the health system in a country. We need to look at how a care economy would change, or rests on initially, and would change structures and relations between people. So I think human security offers that lens. I think we also need to guard against the idea of paternalism. Going back to my point about the critiques of human security, the one which said that it was a cover for securitizing people and biopolitics and so on. I think at perhaps the lesser end of that idea is the charge of paternalism. It's somebody saying, this is what needs to be done to you. This is what I as a government, I as a private sector, a business, a company, I'm going to do this to make your human security better. I'm going to look after you. But I think we need, if we're going to develop a care economy, we need safeguards against that paternalism. And I think human security can offer us a lens to critically evaluate what we mean and what we should do if we change our model more towards a care economy. Okay, so my second point was how could COVID-19 change what we think of as human security? So here I just want to delve a little bit more into not the old critiques, but perhaps some of the new ones that we should start to think about if we're engaging with the concept, particularly as researchers. Now, clearly, inequalities and inequity has been a big theme. It's emerged as a big theme of the COVID pandemic. But what do we really mean by inequality? And how do we tackle it? Does it take us back simply to relying on the kind of economic data that we have at the nation state level? I think human security, funnily enough, has tended to gloss over. It's tended to not engage enough with the idea of inequality. Perhaps sometimes it just emphasizes the opposite. It emphasizes our commonness. We're all humans and it's about people. We face similar, even if they're locally differentiated threats. And I think the danger is that perhaps we don't do enough as human security researchers to engage with the structural barriers to equality and equity. I think that's why some of the feminist human security approaches are quite useful here. And clearly what you have within human security is an idea of individual agency. And I think what human security can do is offer us that framework to consider how social exclusion and discrimination hinder that agency and how those exclusions operate. But I think what we could do more in terms of research and policy is to engage with the tensions between individuals, between groups, and dig deeper down into the problems. I've talked about human security as providing, in a policy and practice sense, a sort of common ground, almost taking us a little bit further to beyond politics. But I think at the same time, we do need to be aware that how do we resolve and detect and resolve the tensions that do exist between individuals and groups in their needs, but also their aspirations and hopes. And indeed, going back to the point about localism, just being very conscious about that localism can be problematic. The Human Development Report, I mentioned UNDP's report last year saying the Human Development Index was going into reverse for the first time in 30 years. And of course, the Human Development Report that was initiated by UNDP in 1994 was the, if you like, the starting point, the genesis of human security. It has suggested that there are new horizons, if you like, that arise when we start to look and think about inequality. So not just to focus on income and wealth, but other dimensions. So obviously access to education being one, and maybe transport if you can't get to a clinic or a hospital. But I think for me also very interestingly is that it adds, if you like, a temporal dimension. We're not talking about things in just one time frame, but how can we use human security to understand inequalities over a long time horizon, and perhaps inequalities between different generations. Generational tensions are definitely something that you find, I find increasingly when I'm researching in the field, that the interests of young people are not the same as their parents, and therefore tensions arise. So I think the temporal dimension, what does human security look like, not just now, if we take a snapshot, but how, does it look if we extend that time horizon over, say, 5, 10, or even more years. I think another discourse that has come out of human development is the shift between focusing on basic needs and a very existential view, what threatens life. If you've read Sabina Al-Khaira, that was, who articulated human security, perhaps in the early days of the concept, it's very much about sort of bare necessities, as it were. But I think what this crisis has done is to make us focus on new inequalities and also new capabilities. So the prime example for me of this is the digital divide and the access to education. So these are both features of the pandemic. We're talking here on a virtual platform. We know that in order to reach, not just to communicate between ourselves, but to reach excluded, marginalized, remote, vulnerable communities, that kind of digital divide is important. And a lot of the work the UN is doing, for example, is making sure people have the equipment and the infrastructure in which to connect. So I think the digital capabilities and education are crucial to life chances, and that's become more apparent during the crisis. So I think the hierarchy of needs and also expectations has shifted. So whereas before we might have had the 7 classic definitions of human security, different kinds of threats, environmental, economic, health, I think the view of the base freedoms and necessities will shift as a result of this crisis. And also, I think a need to focus on what feminists would call intersectionality, the nexuses between different types of people, different threats. So it's not just taking a very singular view of somebody's needs and their expectations. I think it's seeing how those interact. And the example I would give is probably from the economic sphere at the moment. That, for example, in my country, there's starting to be more studies on how Black, Asian, and minority ethnic women need policies to combat job discrimination that endangers their health as well. So there is a sort of a convergence of all kinds of threats that's facing that particular section of the population. And I think using a human security framework is useful in that kind of research. It also argues for much more interdisciplinary research and multidisciplinarity. So I think the intersections of how different harms come together, I think that's a way in which human security perspective is useful, but I think it also forces us to look at how we understand human security and what our kind of criteria and metrics are. So where does this then take us in terms of sorry, I'm just trying to move us on to new areas of human security policy and indeed research as well. I think if I were to sketch some of the areas where I think human security can be applied to the current crisis, I think one is to say how human security can help to analyze and operationalize the nexus, that meeting point between crisis, recovery, and structural change. As I mentioned before, the UN particularly uses this phrase of the humanitarian development peace nexus, and that gives a flavor of the sort of the sequence of policy interventions or the different dimensions. I think the problem then is what we've inherited is an awful lot of silos of activity. So not just the UN, but the UN certainly are trying to get away from that sort of siloed, very individualistic, singular type of policy action, which is built up around these as separate components and trying to bring them together. So I think human security in terms of a type of analysis and human security data can help to blur some of those operational and analytical distinctions, and again give us much more, if you like, fine-grained perspective on what is important to understand in terms of research, what is important to do in terms of policy. And I think there is also clearly a need for multi-stakeholder initiatives to create comprehensive and integrated response. These are growing, often they proliferate madly on the ground. But I think what we need to do now is to go beyond just saying lots of actors need to collaborate and look at the deficit or the lack of governance perhaps behind some of those integrated multi-stakeholder initiatives. In the area that I work in, that has to do with the intervention of big companies. And, it's all very well for companies to have a kind of philanthropic. We run a website which is a sort of data platform giving examples of where companies are working with communities and governments to combat, to address the sort of risks of COVID. And I think it's all fine. I mean, on one hand, you have to say it's great that business is getting involved in these sort of issues which it once felt were not its responsibility. On the other hand, there has to be a governance behind these actions. And I think aid or investment by companies or infrastructure programs, they're still too often done on behalf of or to beneficiaries. So again, you maintain that power imbalance, that structural asymmetry which favors elites. And I think by looking more at how we govern multi-stakeholder initiatives, how we organize them and regulate them, if you like, is an area that requires more attention. And I think finally there needs to be more examples, more research into how legitimacy can be baked into these crisis responses. It's all very well to do things, but they won't last, they won't stick, they won't have popular support, and they won't be durable unless there is a degree of legitimacy. And I think human security can help in that by making those power asymmetries visible through listening to the narratives and the perspectives of individuals and people at the grassroots. But I think that then has to follow through, and how do we move from that to having governance systems locally and also up the chain through to the national and indeed global level that continues to take account of those perspectives. And my final point is to say that given the importance of digital technology, and I think this is especially in fragile settings, and with that emphasis on digital technology, we see a huge power imbalance if you think about the big tech companies on the one hand and yet communities on the other. The power imbalance between providers and consumers. How can we ensure that information technology is empowering and not dehumanizing? Or to put it another way, human security can face new risks, even from tools and capacities that look as though they are democratic and they're democratizing social interaction and including more people than ever before. But we need to understand the detail of that digitally enabled interaction, and if necessary, devise new human security grounded metrics so that the concept of human security is useful there too. I'll finish on that note. I hope I've given you some points for thought and hopefully discussion